Hello, welcome to everyone. It is a pleasure to see all of you here. I recognize some familiar face. David, thank you for being here. Anthony Zola, Borislav, etc., many more in the public. And I am particularly happy to be here with Maruja, who is an old friend and one of the leading experts on issue of migration for Southeast Asia. I am Sciortino. I am the director of Junction, a public venue based in Bangkok, interested in all kinds of key issues for the region and of course migration in all its varied form, voluntary, trafficked as well as forced migration. All of this is extremely relevant for this region. As we will hear, most of the migration in Southeast Asia is intra-regional. And for this, but also, of course, to other locations. And this particular series that we are launching today with the title Towards Safer Southeast Asia Europe Migration Corridors is particularly focused on the migration from Southeast Asia to Europe and eventually also the other way around. We know that also men, particularly from Europe, establish their life in the region. But that is not the topic today per se. Today we are going to give a broader overview of migration in Southeast Asia, which will serve as an overview, a context to contextualize the next five sections. So it's a series at the moment planned for 6 events. We hope to continue, but for now is planned for 6 events in collaboration with the Global Alliance Against Trafficking of Women. And thank you to Bandana and Borislav for initiating this collaboration with Junction. Maruja doesn't really need any introduction. I think she's quite famous by her own value, and she is also part of the Scalabrini Center in the Philippines, which is maybe the most relevant center. Of course, I don't want to do injustice to my own institution, IPSR, Maidon University, which also is a center of migration, and Chulalongkorn is another center. But the Scalabrini is very famous, and also the journal that they produce focusing on migration in Asia. So Maruja, please educate us about migration in Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leah, for the very generous introduction. Now I feel nervous, but I'm truly happy to join the discussion this afternoon. And as I was chatting with Leah earlier, what I did is to prepare some kind of an overview presentation, which I hope will be useful as a point of departure for further discussion and reflection later on. So thanks for the invitation from Leah and also from Bandana. Let me try to share the PowerPoint that I prepared. Is it showing now?
No.
Oh, wait a minute. Let me try one more time. Sorry about that. Still not showing, right?
Can you try click on changing the slide or?
Okay, so should I try to send it to Leah in Facebook? Sorry about that. I don't know why we actually started doing that earlier.
Maybe you can show just smaller, it's okay. Or otherwise.
Wait, let me try one more time. Is it there already?
Yes, we can see when
Okay.
it's minimized, but when
Okay, yeah, I will try to do the slideshow. Sorry, I don't know what's, okay,
Yeah,
there it is,
okay,
right?
okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, but I should start from the very beginning.
Okay, we managed to overcome this technological barrier.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, so I thought that for this afternoon's presentation, since international migration is already a well-established fact of life in the region and especially in Southeast Asia, what I try to do in the outline is to present very broad strokes. No? So hopefully some of the details can come in later when we have the discussion, and I think they will be adequately covered in the next webinars that will be conducted in the next few months. So let's start with a few population and development indicators. Southeast Asia is that small portion of the world which is populated by 675 million people. It's a region where the population is fairly young, with a median age of 30.2 years, and where the population of 65 and over accounts for 7.4% of the total population of Southeast Asia. Of course, the 7.4% elderly population for the region masks individual country differences. What is very interesting for us, because we're dealing and we're going to talk about international migration, is that Southeast Asia is largely a region with a net immigration profile. So as you can see, international migrants to the region are estimated at 10.6 million, while international migrants from the region are estimated at 23.5 million. And what has been mentioned earlier is that for the region as a whole, for Asia, the dominant form of migration in the region is that a lot of it occurs within the region. And this is especially true for Southeast Asia, where about 1/3 of international migrants from the region remain within Southeast Asia. Of course, there are certain exceptions, as we will see later. We can probably divide migration from Southeast Asia into three main corridors. First of all, there's the Intra-Asia migration corridor, and then there's the exchange between Southeast Asia and Europe, and between Southeast Asia and traditional countries of settlement. You will see a black line that divides Asia with the other corridors. And what that line means basically is that it differentiates the main characteristic of intra-Asia migration, which is largely temporary migration, especially when we talk about the migration experience of less skilled migrant workers. So intra-Asia migration can be further subdivided into migration within Southeast Asia. Then there's the flow from Southeast Asia to East Asia, and of course, the flow from Southeast Asia to the Gulf countries. The experience actually of temporary labor migration in the region is very much linked to the emergence of the Gulf countries in the 1970s as alternative destination countries for migrant workers in the 1970s. So that actually started the labor migration experience of many countries in the region. So in the 1970s, the Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, Pakistan, and India, they were among the countries that sent large numbers of workers to the Gulf countries, which were experiencing labor shortage, amidst a situation where they had massive infrastructure projects brought about by the large influx of petrodollars. So in the 1970s, it was largely to the Gulf countries, that is the oil-rich countries. And then in the 1980s, when several countries in East Asia started to develop and to industrialize, then it was also from Southeast Asia to the East Asian countries of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. These are the three major countries that received large numbers of workers from Southeast Asia. I'd like to mention in particular Taiwan, because Taiwan, when it started its transition as a labor destination country, it placed a special focus on sourcing migrant workers from the Asean countries. And the Southeast Asia to East Asia labor migration started around the 1980s, and then progressing and intensifying in the 1990s, while within Southeast Asia, we see a lot more of this from the 1990s. Let me just highlight a few things here. So Southeast Asia actually has a very interesting migration profile. Unlike East Asia, East Asian countries are largely destination countries. So Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and even China is also starting to receive international migrants as well. South Asia is largely a region of out-migration. But in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, you would find a combination of mainly origin countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, as you can see here, and then mainly destination countries, which are represented by Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, and countries that are both origin and destination, of which Malaysia and Thailand are the examples. The figures that you see in the different countries, those are the figures of international migration from Southeast Asia that remain within the region. So for example, the figure that you would see for Indonesia, there would be, that means that there are 1.42 million Indonesians that are present in Southeast Asian destination countries. It's very important to consider the geographical configuration of the countries in the region, because a large part of the migration trends and patterns are very much defined by geography. So for example, if we look at the map of mainland Southeast Asia, it's understandable to appreciate that Thailand is the hub of international migration coming from the neighboring countries of Myanmar, with which it shares a long land border, and also the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos. And when we come to peninsular or insular Southeast Asia, we also see that in the case of Malaysia and Indonesia, they are neighboring countries, and also they share a lot of cultural similarities as well, including some similarities in language. And so it's also easy to understand why there's a large presence of Indonesians in Malaysia. And as I will explain later on, irregular migration in Southeast Asia is also very significant. We go back first to what I had shown you earlier, because when we compare intra-Asian migration with the other corridors, the main difference, and this is talking in very broad strokes, is that in Asia, there's very little possibility of long-term residence, and there's very little possibility of acquiring another citizenship, because migration is very much premised on temporary labor migration, and people are not supposed to stay and settle and acquire citizenship in the long run. So that's the main difference with the two other corridors. And as you can see, both in Europe, European destinations, as well as in the traditional settlement countries, namely the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the possibilities and pathways for citizenship are broader. And what you can also see here is that the arrows point in both directions. So there's movement from Southeast Asia to the settlement countries, but there's also considerable movement from the settlement countries to Southeast Asia as well. And the same can be said for the Southeast Asia and Europe corridor. In the case of Europe, Europe is quite an interesting destination because, in a sense, Europe does not actively recruit migrant workers and professionals from Southeast Asia. But nonetheless, if there's a flow of workers and there's a flow of migrants from Southeast Asia to Europe, to several European destinations, Once they qualify and they are eligible, there's always the possibility for long-term residence and citizenship. Okay. Here, I'd like to share with you, I'm sharing with you the percentage of female migrants among the migrant stock by source country in Southeast Asia. Female migration in Asia in general and in Southeast Asia in particular is quite significant. I'd like to mention that the figures and the percentage that are shown here are based on migrant stock, which is different from migrant flow statistics. So this is from the migration data portal of the UN. And for the world as a whole, 48% of the world's international migrant stock comprises of women or females rather. But the share in Southeast Asia is greater. So it's closer to 50%. And if we look at the individual countries, you can see here that Thailand, in terms of migrant stock, has the largest share of female international migrants at 61%. So those that are above 50% are Cambodia, the Philippines, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, and Malaysia. And the rest are below 50%. So again, I'd just like to mention that we are talking here about migrant stock, which is different from migration flow statistics. Okay? And this is what I mean by migration flow statistics. And this is this describes the share of women among labor migrants. So these figures refer to the profile or the percentage of women among those who leave origin countries on a year-per-year basis. And I'd like to point your attention to the figures for the Philippines and Indonesia. In the previous slide, which was based on migrant stock, Indonesia did not figure as a source country of female migrants. But when it comes to labor migration and when it comes to outflows, annual outflows of labor migrants from the different countries, you can see here that the Philippines and Indonesia have more than 50% of the migrant workers that leave the country every year comprise of women. And for the rest, the comparison, for example, with South Asian countries is quite stark because the share of migrant women that leave the country every year is less than 20% for countries such as Bangladesh, Nepal, and hardly anything from Pakistan and India. So again, just to compare, in the earlier slide, Thailand was highest in having the largest share of female among the international migrant stock. But when it comes to the flow statistics of labor migrants, Thailand has less than 50% of women migrants, which means to say that in Thailand, the profile of most migrant workers is largely that of men. Okay. Before the pandemic, the trend, especially when it comes to labor migration, is that the trend and the expectation is that labor migration was on an upward trend. And perhaps one of the exceptions to that would be the pattern of Indonesia. So this is data for 2013 and 2017. And it's interesting to note that in 2013, there were more than 512,000 migrants who left Indonesia to take up overseas employment in other parts of the world. But by 2017, it was down to 261,820. And Indonesia, in this regard, departs from the pattern as well as from the expectation of increasing levels of outmigration, particularly when it comes to labor migration. And part of the reason for that is because of the ban that the Indonesian government imposed, specifically not just for one country, but for a whole region, for the Middle East destinations, which it imposed sometime in 2017. Of course, there are many debates when it comes to the effectiveness of bans. But at least as far as official figures are concerned, we see that there has been a downward trend from 2015. There's a big difference between 2014 and 2015, and 2015 down the line. So when it comes to trends and patterns, these are the patterns that have been observed for close to 5 decades already, since labor migration intensified from the region and within the region from the 1970s. So despite the fact that labor migration is supposed to be temporary, and it is something that's desired by both countries of origin as well as countries of destination, but despite the intention of governments to keep it temporary, temporary labor migration continues. And so that's why we have come to describe this phenomenon as being permanently temporary. What is also characteristic of labor migration, in particular in Southeast Asia, is that majority of migrants work in less skilled occupations. Again, if we go back to the earlier slide, you can see here that, and this is for Indonesia, that the occupations are mainly as domestic workers, caregivers, operators, and plantation workers. And in a way, this is not much different from the occupational profile of many other origin countries in Southeast Asia. So this is a cause for concern because especially in the case, for example, of domestic workers, they work under, domestic workers are not included in the labor laws of most destination countries. And so that's a big part of the problems that they face while they are abroad. But again, domestic work migration poses really some kind of a dilemma for governments in the region, and also not just in Southeast Asia, but for other Asian countries that also deploy migrant workers, because the demand for domestic workers is something that's quite consistent. And in fact, it's not just consistent, but also there's an increasing demand for domestic workers. So actually the participation of women in migration in the region is in many ways driven by the demand for domestic workers. It's a dilemma for many countries of origin because on the one hand, there's a lot of concerns about safety, about protection, and about the welfare of domestic workers, particularly when they're abroad. But then at the same time, this is one occupation for which there has always been, the demand has always been on the upside. And also what's quite notable about migration in Southeast Asia, as well as for that of the region as a whole, is the important role that the migration industry continues to play, particularly in facilitating labor migration. So since the 1970s, the migration industry has, meaning to say, private recruitment agencies, has been an important player. And in fact, it's a stakeholder that is that has driven labor migration in the region and beyond, because of course they have a stake in perpetuating labor migration because it's part of their business, and basically they're in the business of placing and matching migrant workers with employers in different parts of the region and in the world. And also what has been true for the longest time is the significance of irregular migration. As I will also mention later on, even if institutions and migration policies have already developed in the region over time, but the regulation of migration is very challenging, and irregular migration continues to be very important. And again, in this regard, Malaysia and Thailand are very significant. As you can see, in the case of Malaysia, there are more migrants in an undocumented or in an unauthorized situation compared to those that are there in Malaysia in a legal situation. The same can be said about Thailand as well. And again, if we go back to the map that was shown earlier, in part, what this also shows is, the significance of geography and the fact that, especially in the case of Thailand, the borders are very porous, and they share a lot of land borders with the neighboring countries as a whole. That, of course, is a facilitating factor. The other important factors that can be mentioned as far as the persistence of irregular migration is concerned is, of course, the demand for workers, and specifically perhaps the demand for workers whose wages can be paid lower compared to those that are in a legal situation. Irregular migration, part of irregular migration also, of course, includes trafficking in persons. But I think in Southeast Asia, maybe it would be appropriate to consider first the scope of irregular migration, and of which trafficking is a subset of irregular migration. Especially also in countries that are contiguous to each other. One of the factors that has also been identified as to why irregular migration takes place is also because of corruption. But we should not also disregard the role of social networks that have been established, well established, particularly in the border areas. But in addition to the well-trodden trends and patterns, as well as characteristics that have been noted, we can also see some emergence of maybe new patterns as well and new trends. So while temporary labor migration continues to be dominant, which means that temporary labor migration actually plays a very structural role in the process of industrialization and development in many countries of destination, we can also see that other movements have come up. There are other forms and types of migration that are taking place in the region. So there's student migration, there's also marriage migration, and there's also still the reality of forced migration. Countries of destination and countries of origin can no longer specifically and solely define themselves as just being exclusively countries of origin or countries of destination, because both types of migration are already taking place. So for example, in the case of origin countries, although out-migration might still be predominant, but they're also starting to receive international migrants as well. And again, one example of this is a recent development in Indonesia, which has a recent policy to attract skilled migrants. What is also interesting and something that's quite common among origin countries in Southeast Asia is that all of them, Indonesia, the Philippines, Laos PDR, Cambodia, and Vietnam, all of them are receiving a noticeable influx of migration coming from China. So for some countries, this has, of course, raised some concerns. And destination countries are also experiencing losing their nationals and encouraging return migration. And an example of this would be Singapore, which has made overtures to its overseas population to encourage return migration to Singapore. And if return migration is not possible, then at least the government also tries to keep in touch with their diaspora population so that there will be continuing links between Singapore and their overseas nationals, and for their overseas nationals also to still be part of the nation, and especially still to be part of national development as well. Although Southeast Asia in particular and Asia in general is not a settlement region, we are seeing some settlement in Southeast Asia and the Asian region. And this is largely due to marriage migration. Marriage migration actually is not just from the region to other countries, like for example, from Vietnam to Korea and Taiwan, also from Cambodia to Korea, or from the Philippines and Thailand to Korea, as well as Japan and Taiwan. So these are the countries that are receiving marriage migrants from Southeast Asia. But also there is some marriage migration that is taking place in Southeast Asia, although maybe the numbers are not quite comparative compared to the trend from Southeast Asia to East Asia. And actually, I see this as something that's quite interesting, no? Because Southeast Asia actually is a very multicultural region. No? Its ethnic diversity is quite huge in Southeast Asia. But when it comes to marriage migration, there are restrictions. No? So for instance, in Singapore, it's not actually quite easy for migrant workers to get married to locals, to Singapore nationals, and especially for those in less skilled occupations. No? Again, for Malaysia also, migrant workers actually are not encouraged to marry locals. And in fact, for migrant workers who would marry local citizens, they might actually stand the risk of losing their contract, no? Which is quite different in East Asia, because we normally think of East Asian societies and countries like Japan and South Korea as relatively homogeneous, and yet policies concerning marriage migration to these countries are relatively more liberal, no, compared to that in Southeast Asia. So Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are main destinations of marriage migrants coming from Southeast Asia. Okay, so quite for marriage migration within Southeast Asia, that's quite under the radar. I also talk here about de facto settlement, and this is in relation actually to migrants in an irregular situation that have stayed for a long time in countries like Thailand and Malaysia. No? So it's de facto settlement because they continue to reside and work in these countries, but actually without legal status. And especially in Thailand, and to some extent also in Malaysia, there's already a second generation that has been born to migrant workers who have been working for a long time in these countries. So they don't have any legal citizenship, but nonetheless, they continue to reside and work in these countries. And so this raises questions about inclusion. No? So, for example, in South Korea, which has experienced significant marriage migration, South Korea has gone quite ahead in developing policies to promote multiculturalism. Of course, the multiculturalism in Korea has a South Korean characteristic as well, because it's largely addressed to marriage migrants and to families where one of the parents is non-Korean. So it has a very specific meaning in that context. But I think what's important to highlight here is that these policies at least try to promote inclusion of foreign migrants who are married to South Korean nationals, and to promote their inclusion, although maybe the model is more along assimilation lines. No? And we also have to think of the children and young migrants that have already become part of de facto settlements, especially in Southeast Asia, or the second generation in countries where they are allowed to have legal access to citizenship. So far, because our attention in the region has been focused on temporary labor migration, we think mostly in terms of migrant workers, and specifically migrant workers in their economically active ages. So when they participate in the labor market. But we also have to consider that migrants are aging as well. And in some contexts and in some destinations where there's already the presence of young people, we also have to think of inclusion policies for children and youth migrants. When it comes to forced migration, although refugee movements were very dominant in the 1970s, but nonetheless, forced migration continues to be part of the migration experience in Southeast Asia. So some countries in the region are becoming also the source, as well as the transit and destination countries of forced migrants. Actually, what I'd like to mention here is that in the case of Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, they are becoming destinations of forced migrants coming from other parts of Southeast Asia, notably from Myanmar. So Malaysia and Thailand, they receive quite a sizable number of forced migrants coming from Myanmar, mostly Rohingyas. And Indonesia has become a transit country of forced migrants coming from other parts of the world as well. Something that has not yet been discussed as much in our part of the world is climate-related migration. Countries, for example, like the Philippines, they are susceptible to many disasters, including human-made and environmentally related induced migration. But there has not much attention has been paid to climate-related migration issues in Southeast Asia. And the possibility is that a lot of this is likely to impact internal migration more than cross-border migration. Okay. So if you look at the Southeast Asia and Europe corridor, again, there are also some established patterns. So refugee or humanitarian migration was quite dominant in the 1970s and 1990s. And this is very much associated with the end of Vietnam War in 1975, and also the rest of the end of the conflict in the Indochina sub-region. So a lot of a sizable refugee and humanitarian migration took place between the 1970s and the 1990s. Part also of the Southeast Asia-Europe corridor includes marriage migration from countries like the Philippines and Thailand. And in the case of countries like Thailand, part of this is also facilitated by tourism to Thailand, which then becomes one of the factors that also contribute to marriage migration. Then there's nurse migration as well, specifically coming from the Philippines. And domestic worker migration. Again, the Philippines is a major source country of domestic worker migration to Europe. And there's also a specific type of migration coming from the Philippines, which is somewhat associated with domestic work migration, although it is not supposed to be a labor migration program. And that is the migration of au pairs from the Philippines, largely to countries in the Nordic region. Because of the possibility of settlement and the acquiring of citizenship in European destinations, then there's already the presence of second and later generations in several European destinations. I'd also like to mention that in the case of Vietnam, there was labor migration as well as student migration to the Eastern Bloc before the 1990s, and that has also become part of the reasons why there's second and later generations of people of Vietnamese origin in countries like Germany, and also Poland and the Czech Republic. And as I've mentioned earlier, the flows between Southeast Asia and Europe are bidirectional. It's not only from Southeast Asia, but also from Europe to Southeast Asia. And the migration from Europe to Southeast Asia is driven by also the search for economic opportunities, as well as by lifestyle motivations, marriage migration, and to some extent, retirement migration as well. So what we're also seeing is that some of the old destinations, actually, we were just probably not aware of them because migration to these countries had started some time ago, but they are lesser known to us. Is also that part of Europe, the Nordic region, which has been receiving nurses from the Philippines, and also some indication of some labor migration from Thailand to Finland, which is the case of the Thai berry pickers, which are seasonal workers in Finland. And there could be the emergence of new labor destinations and new labor markets, particularly in Eastern Europe. So actually before the pandemic, there was already some initial discussions between stakeholders from the Philippines and countries like Poland and the Czech Republic. And this was just stopped and was stalled because the pandemic happened. But there had been some discussions already about the possibility to recruit more workers from the Philippines. And what has been known quite recently is also the emergence of new transit routes for migration from Vietnam and the use of Serbia and Romania as new transit routes for Vietnamese migration to Europe. So actually, as I mentioned earlier, Vietnamese migration to the Czech Republic, for example, is an old destination because of the arrangements that were made between the governments of Vietnam and some of the governments in what was then the Soviet bloc. And perhaps what we are not seeing yet, in terms at least of studies and in terms of research, are other types of migration, such as student migration. Of course, COVID-19 has exerted a lot of impact on migration in Southeast Asia and beyond. So there has been a drastic decline in the outmigration of temporary migrant workers. And this is most prominent for cases like the Philippines. So this is data coming from a recent study and report that was published by the ADB, OECD, and ILO. So the biggest decline when we compare the deployment of workers between 2019 and 2020 is that for the Philippines, which was a 78 drop in deployment levels. Because by the 2019, there were already, the deployment from the Philippines already approached 2.1 million. But then by 2020, it was down by 78%. And the other Southeast Asian countries here, all of them also experienced decline, like Vietnam experienced a decline of 48%, Myanmar 68%, Thailand 72%, or rather 64%, and Thailand 64%, and Sri Lanka, but that's Southeast Asia, South Asia is 72%. So the deployment levels had been very dramatic. But also what we are seeing is that if there's a down in the deployment levels, then we saw a lot of return and repatriation of migrant workers to home countries. For the Philippines, for example, and I guess this would be true to other countries of origin as well, the return of migrant workers coming from countries that have been affected by the pandemic has been most substantial and perhaps the greatest challenge as far as return migration is concerned. And it's not only because of the numbers, but also because the return was something that was unexpected. And the return also did not really foster a lot of confidence, because once migrants were returning from being displaced from countries of employment, and when they returned to their countries of origin, they faced another set of challenges as well, because domestic unemployment was also very huge in the countries of origin. So COVID-19 did impact immigration pressures. There's a lot of pressure to find alternatives in other countries, but then there are not too many opportunities, and so overseas employment became some kind of a limited option for many of those who had returned unexpectedly. And so the focus now, especially as far as policies and approaches in the countries of origin are concerned, is to develop policies and programs that would work towards sustainable reintegration, while at the same time also acknowledging that once the situation improves, once the health situation becomes safer for everyone, then there's always the possibility of remigration, because actually this is also part of the aspirations of those who have returned coming from the pandemic. Many of the migrant workers who return to their countries of origin still entertain the possibility of working abroad again someday once the health situation improves. In the case of destination countries, there has been a drastic decline in the number of foreign workers, and some countries actually experienced labor shortage during this time. So one example of that would be Malaysia. It experienced labor shortage in a key sector such as plantation. And so Malaysia had a policy of what it called recalibration program, wherein some of the workers who were displaced from the other sectors, they can transfer to some of the sectors which are in need of migrant workers, like in the plantation sector, as an example. We saw a lot of problems that migrant workers experience in the destination countries, and an example of this would be what happened in Singapore. Initially, Singapore was cited as a country that had a very good response to the pandemic, but later on, there was an upsurge in the number of infections in Singapore, and a lot of this was happening among migrant workers who were staying in dormitories. So actually what we saw as the problems that migrant workers experienced during the pandemic were problems that had been there all along. It's just that the pandemic highlighted what these problems were and the intensity of these problems. And what it also showed us, what the pandemic also showed us, is really the big gap in social protection, whether on the to migrant workers, whether on the side of the destination countries or when they return to their countries of origin. And even if cooperation with origin countries is something that has been encouraged in some of the regional processes and some of the regional instruments, when it comes to reintegration, when it comes to return migration, particularly under crisis situation, the cooperation with origin countries was still not forthcoming. In fact, it was rather quite minimal. Okay, so this is just to show again outflows from countries of origin, and you can see the big drop. I think what we need to pay attention to is the comparison between the 2019 outflows from selected Asian countries and what happened in 2020. So there was really a very big dip from 2019 to 2020. Okay. So there has been a regional response in the ASEAN as far as responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there was a move towards updating the ASEAN guidelines for effective return and reintegration of migrant workers. So this was actually completed in 2019, but there was a lot of discussion in 2020 when the pandemic happened, and to make it up to date and also to consider what needs to be done when we have to deal with something as significant and widespread as a pandemic. Also, in the case of ASEAN, there has been a lot of discussion on the implementation of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework of 2020. And one of the points that was highlighted in this framework is the need for the portability of social security rights of migrant workers between ASEAN member states. So this is an important recognition because of, as we have seen, there is significant intra-ASEAN movement within our sub-region. And the document also makes mention of the need to pay attention to gender-sensitive and gender-responsive approaches when it comes to reintegration programs and policies. But we are also expecting that there's also going to be an impact on migration and mobility beyond labor migration. as far as migration trends are concerned, we are seeing a very cautious return to migration over the short term. So actually um, the deployment levels, even in 2021, are still generally low across all Asian countries of origin, and also a relatively modest intake of foreign workers on the part of destination countries as well. What the pandemic has also taught us is that perhaps from now on, there will be a lot of attention that would be paid to the health screening of migrants, and this might actually add to the cost of migration. It is also possible that for some occupations and sectors, there might be some move towards hybrid approaches. So, for example, there are some discussions and there are speculations that in the case of highly skilled migrants, maybe migration may not be necessary for them in the future, from now on and in the future, because some of the work that is being done by the highly skilled is actually work that can be conducted from anywhere. So this idea of working from home can also be extended to international migrants as well. There's also been some speculation that even in the case of student migration, perhaps this is also a type of migration where some hybrid trends and patterns might come up as well. Maybe part of the school experience, of the educational experience of international student migrants might be conducted from where they are, from home, but part of it may be conducted also in their desired destination countries. When it comes to migration governance, I would just like to mention a few patterns here. One is that we are almost done.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we're almost done. So actually, there's already been a lot of developments in terms of developing migration institutions and policies, although of course, there are varying histories and degrees of institutionalization. So for example, the Philippines is far away, has developed, I guess, the farthest in this regard. And some countries like Cambodia are starting to develop their own institutions and policies. What is also quite notable about Southeast Asia is that there had been a lot of regional discussion and consultation on migration-related issues in the Asean, and compared, for example, to SAARC, the Association of South Asian Countries. I guess there are more steps that have been taken in ASEAN compared to SAARC in particular. So for example, visa-free arrangements for social visit have been facilitating travel within ASEAN for a very long time. And when it comes to migration-related regional instruments and agreements, we have quite a number of them already. And we are also part of cross-regional processes. So among the important instruments here in the region is the ASEAN Declaration on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers in 2017, which developed from the 2000 agreement way back in 2007. But one thing though that is very missing here is that when it comes to migrants in an irregular situation, they are not part of the agreement or declaration, which recognizes the need to provide them protection. Okay, so the last slide are probably lessons from the pandemic that we can take with us when we reflect upon maybe what we can do in the future and what we can expect. I just highlighted here a number of things. I think the common experience of immobility throughout the world is something that all of us experienced. We had been forced not to move. And hopefully this experience of not being able to move will sensitize us to the importance of providing facilities and providing a pathway for safe and regular movements for many types of international migrants. The pandemic has also taught us about the contributions of migrants. And I highlight here, among others, the contributions, for example, of seafarers, which made possible the movement of goods and necessary equipment during the time of the pandemic, and which to some extent, actually to a large extent, made global trade possible. And that is one of the reasons why they also were considered as essential workers during the pandemic. One lesson, of course, I hope that we can also take with us is that migrants are not necessarily transmitters of COVID-19. Rather, the lack of attention to migrants' welfare and protection rendered them vulnerable during the pandemic. So I guess we have to be more inclusive also in our way of thinking, that no one is protected unless everyone is protected. So this is in the health domain, but this is also something that we can expand to other domains in our societies. During the pandemic, many countries of origin and many countries of destination made very important steps towards whole of society approaches in responding to the pandemic. And we hope that these types of approaches, whole of society approaches that involves the participation, not just of different government agencies, but of different stakeholders, including migrants, this will be part also of our ways of moving forward, of being inclusive and holistic. And thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. I think you had a very extensive, comprehensive presentation. This is why, even if it has taken almost the full hours, I think it was very instructive, and I think we all learned a lot. We have time only for a few questions. I think we will go 10 minutes overboard. I am sure people are still interested. I have a few questions. One is a comment actually about, but you may want to elaborate, which is about migration from Southeast Asia to China. And so it's not only from China to Southeast Asia, but among others, there are also people moving from Southeast Asia, the example from Myanmar and Vietnam. Then there is a question from Fabio Saini. What has been the reaction in Southeast Asia to the Global Compact on Safe Migration? Are any of the compact's objectives being taken seriously, and what is progress? But please, short. I know there is a lot to say about this. From David, I was at a UN social protection meeting regarding need for portability of social security 10 years ago. Does not seem that much has moved forward, and I want to add, as I am doing together with colleague, an overview of social protection in Southeast Asia. Actually, not many migrants have, to start with, any kind of social security. So even this discussion on portability seems quite irrelevant. Considering the present condition of migrants is very clear. They have absolutely no social security. One country which has is Thailand, one of the few, but actually no one was able to access it, and it's very minor. And they pay for that too. I mean, they have to pay, contrary to other citizens. So please reflect on this. And the last from Bandana. Many thanks. You are right. Unfortunately, cost of migration may increase in the post-pandemic world, while access to basic service and decent accommodation and working conditions still not much is being done about. I mean, maybe you want to suggest some strategy. So I know these are all very comprehensive, require a lot of discussion, but as I say, we don't have much time. So please keep it short to the point. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So as far as I can remember, yes, the discussion about social security, social protection is still actually at a very early stage here in Southeast Asia. So I'm glad that in a way it has been acknowledged, that there is a need to pay attention to that in the document that was made during the time of the pandemic, because it was very obvious. There was really very little social protection for migrant workers, either at their either where they work or upon their return to their countries of origin. So that is something that has to be worked on, and I do hope that it's something that our governments in the region will pay a lot more attention to, and perhaps actually for all types of workers, because even for the local workers, the workers within the countries, within each of the individual countries, unless the unless they are fairly well developed, the social protection aspects are also rather loose, no? And not really that protective when people lose their jobs. The comment about Southeast Asians also going to China, yes, that is happening. And I know that that's also happening because in the case, for instance, of teachers from the Philippines going to China, that was quite increasing in terms of numbers. But because of the pandemic, somehow there was a stop to that. No? So I think what we are actually seeing and what we are witnessing is really movements towards more people exchange. No? So that's why it cannot only be said that one country is simply, solely, exclusively a country of origin or destination, but both. And I think recognizing this is also very important, because what that means is that we have to update our policies as well as prepare our institutions for the influx of people. No? And speaking, for example, specifically for countries of origin like the Philippines, no? Our migration laws, when it comes to the entrance, no, to the admission of foreigners to the country, we still are using the Philippine Nationality Act of 1940. So that was even before the Philippines became an independent country. And so there's really a lot to update when it comes to laws, when it comes to policies also concerning the influx, no, of foreign nationals to what are normally known as countries of origin. There was a question about the Global Compact on migration. I think governments are taking the Global Compact on migration quite seriously, and especially because some countries in the region are considered to be champion countries of the GCM. Philippines, Cambodia. I think there's one more other country that's part of the champion countries. When it comes to government response, I think to the Global Compact on migration, particularly in trying to maybe provide updates on what the governments are doing in terms of meeting the objectives and the goals of the 23 goals and objectives of the Global Compact. I think governments are quite serious, especially I think in the case of countries of origin. I'm not so sure about countries of destination in the region, whether they are as excited or as enthusiastic about the Global Compact for migration, but I think countries of origin are quite active, no, in this regard. To some extent, also civil society organizations are part of the process of seeing to it that the Global Compact on migration, the goals are implemented. And in fact, I think in the last review, the first review, no, that was held in New York, there was quite an active participation of civil society organizations from Asia. No? So, but what remains to be seen are the impact, no, in terms of how they have made lives better for migrants. I don't know. Was there one other question?
No, I think you have answered, or maybe yes, maybe about what can be done about the cost of migration
yes,
that are going to increase, and also
right now,
improve
yeah.
basic service and decent accommodation. I think as the pandemic has shown, living conditions are very poor.
I think that situation is very much in flux, no? And it also depends on the countries of destination. But what really would be very important to do in that regard is to, I would say, bilateral discussions. Bilateral discussions between the origin and destination countries are very important in order to really in order to know what are the responsibilities of workers and what are the responsibilities of employers. Because, but things are changing now though. No? Things are changing now. So I don't know how many days of quarantine are still required in various destination countries. In some destinations like Hong Kong has very tough requirements for quarantine. I'm not sure if they have changed that already. So it's very important to know who is footing the bill. No? Whether migrants are the ones that are paying for their quarantine, and then what are the terms? When does, are there salary deductions that are involved? Because what should be there is that migrants should not be paying for quarantine, and they should still pay their, they should still have their monthly pay, and these types of information have to be clear and to be communicated properly to migrants so that they know what their rights are. But it's kind of difficult really, because it depends on the destination countries. On the side of origin countries, they can always say that in your contract, it says that employers are supposed to cover X and X and X items, and you're supposed to have benefits, X and X and so forth. But the real situation and the real negotiation happens when the migrants are already in the destination. And what kinds of access to support and assistance do they really have? And what kinds of access to redress do they have if they are, if those conditions are violated? So I think in that regard, labor unions, other stakeholders also like CSOs also have a very important role to play, just to make sure that whatever has been agreed between countries of origin and countries of destination are in fact enforced and migrants are not left on their own.
Thank you very much also for this optimistic. We know how difficult it is to realize what you are proposing, and I think it also an issue of management of migration. Maybe time to start to think about regional area where migrants can move more freely within ASEAN, let's say, rather than going through this bilateral contracts which put a lot of power in the hands of the destination country. But this is for the future. At the moment, we are still far from that, as we have seen during the COVID pandemic, a lot of xenophobic sentiments. And Singapore, unfortunately, like you mentioned, migrants still are kept in the dormitories even after they are vaccinated, and still their mobility is still limited, which doesn't make sense from an epidemiological point of view, nor as a human rights issue for all of people in this region. So there is a lot of work to be done, and thank you, Maruja, for again giving us so much information, which will be useful for all of us working on this issue to transform it into action and advocacy and change, to advocate for better policies as we move forward in the recovery of the countries of Southeast Asia. For those in the public, please continue to follow us. We are going to have a series every bi-monthly, every 2 months actually, and we also have another series with Maidon University, the migration center there, which also focuses on migration issues in Southeast Asia, while this is in particular will be more on the Europe, like what Maruja has described as the trend to going to Europe. So that will be the main focus of this particular series, and I hope you will continue to follow us. Please help us share the link so that more people become aware of this issue. So once more, thank you to our partner, as well as to Maruja and to all of you here and on Facebook for following us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Milena. Bye-bye.